critically analyzing global affairs. The Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, joined by James Freeman and Alex KRAINER. And we're looking at the potential collapse of Great Britain, not least as a result of our economic policies and also our policy in Ukraine. And I was just talking to Alex during the break about what we like to do on the Muckrakers is unpack the jargon, assume that people are not all experts in economics and so on and so forth. And I know, James, you wanted to pick up on a few points.
Yeah, I do, Alex. It's really, really interesting. I did watch your video on Rumble this morning. Really, really interesting. I think some really good points you brought up. Just in terms of my understanding, though, so these bondholders that were basically that Ukraine now is putting off, it's not going to pay the £20 billion. My understanding is they're companies such as BlackRock, PIMCO, Fidelity, all of the big global investment firms that, they've got trillions and trillions on their books. So how does that tie then that liabilities to those global investors to Great Britain? What is the link there?
I'm not sure exactly, but I assume that a lot of the British pension funds have exposure to those bonds and to companies like BlackRock and PIMCO and so forth. So I'm not sure this is still the case, but the British pension funds, in order to generate sufficient returns in this low interest rate environment, have actually taken leveraged positions in various financial instruments that were regarded as safe. So when Kwasi Kwarteng presented his mini budget in September 2023, the market reaction was that the gilts and the British pound sold off, and because they were leveraged, they had to meet margin calls, which they suddenly had, thousands of them. And in order to meet their margin calls, they proceeded to sell off their gilt balances, and so that started on 22nd or 23rd September 2022. By 27th September, so within 5 days, there were no more buyers for long-dated British gilts. And so now there was a risk that the price is going to nosedive, that it's going to just collapse. And so the Bank of England had to step in, and they had to step in with about £40 billion to purchase all these gilts off of British pension funds. And so I think that the exposure is probably pretty widespread, and that even if a pension fund doesn't own directly Ukraine bonds, they might own various other funds held by BlackRock or PIMCO or Amundi or somebody like that, or they might have exposure to gilts. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on sorry, James, just before you move on from that, I promised that we'd cut through the jargon and things like that. And I just, for the sake of everybody listening, can you just explain what gilts and margin calls are?
Okay, so gilts are British government bonds, so the British sovereign debt. And a margin call is basically when you trade, when you have leveraged position in something. Let's say you have $1 million worth of gold on your in your trade book, but you only trade that on a margin, and margin is only a fraction of that full amount. And let's say if you only have 10% of cash on the margin, as soon as your exposure to gold declines by 10%, you lost the whole margin. And so now your trade book is negative. Now you have to provide cash to your broker so that you're in the black. Okay, so that margin is only there to absorb any losses that you might temporarily incur in holding some asset. But the margin has to be positive. You have to always keep the margin requirement as required. As there's always a certain minimum, which in case of bonds will probably be 50%. In case of futures, it might be something between 2 and 10%. But you have to have the cash to meet the margin requirement. And so if you don't have other cash, then you have to go sell some other asset. So in the case of these pension funds, which were completely exposed across the board because they have very difficult time generating sufficient returns to stay viable, they had to sell their gilt positions. And there, the selling pressure suddenly came to a risk of collapsing the whole gilt market, which will have a lot of repercussions because it will spike the interest rate. And, James was saying, during the pandemic days, the Bank of England printed up 400 billion pounds, correct. But the interest rate back then was very close to zero. The interest rate today is 5%. So you have to come up with the cash to service this debt. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, very well explained there, Alex. So basically you get a downward cycle, don't you, where everyone has to sell off their assets, which brings prices down further, which generates more margin calls when it goes round and round and round again. The other question I've got, Alex, is on the UK government's debt to Ukraine as well. And that was where I was confused, because that's what I thought you were talking about, because, of course, there are lots of loans that the World Bank has given Ukraine, which if Ukraine defaults on those, then the UK is actually a backer of that. So I think it works out that if Ukraine stops paying, then it's around 375 million per year that the UK will have to pick up in terms of loan guarantees. So I wasn't sure whether you were talking about that or whether you were talking about the private sort of investors and the links to UK pensions. But I think you explained that very clearly. So thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, very good on that. But let's follow up on that. And in terms of, I did sort of hint at before the break, is that why are we so invested in Ukraine? Bearing in mind that we have, as you say, a cost of living crisis here, pensioners worried about heating or eating, that we have an impending financial crisis here in the UK because of these billions that are disappeared somewhere. We're not quite sure how many billions it is. Why are we so invested in Ukraine, Alex?
I think it goes back to Mackinder's geopolitics, and just to give a reminder to your viewers and listeners, Halford Mackinder was one of the great ideologues of the British Empire at the turn of the 20th century, and he wrote in 1904. He wrote something called Geopolitical Pivot of History. And so, to summarize it, basically his hypothesis was that it was a mistake for the British Empire to focus only on being a maritime empire, and he theorized that there would be a land-based empire that would emerge from the so-called pivot state, and the pivot state would be the area around the Caucasus, North Iran, South Russia, Ukraine, parts of Kazakhstan and Afghanistan. And Mackinder believed that there would be a land empire that would emerge there. Now, at the same time, that this empire would potentially become so powerful that it would become a rival to the British Empire. And so the strategy to prevent this from happening and to maintain the empire's hegemony over the Eurasian landmass, which has been always the central obsession, both of the British Empire and its reincarnation, the American Empire, would be to surround this area with a number of beachheads, meaning where the empire's navies could supply the land armies of countries like France, Italy, India, Korea. That's what Halford Mackinder identified at the time, and where these armies could always pool Russia, which was identified as the most likely power to emerge as the pivot state and the pivot empire, in these continuous quagmire wars to keep it weak, always, so that it might not emerge as a how do you call it, as a rival. Well, in the meantime, there's been Israel that has been created as another beachhead explicitly for that purpose. And Ukraine as well has been cultivated for this very same reason. So the two things that are very viable there for the empire is not only that it weakens Russia as a rival on the Eurasian landmass, but Russia itself is the world's largest treasure trove of resource wealth, which is estimated between $75 trillion and $90 trillion.
Right.
So if you grab the control of those resources, then those resources can become the collateral for your financial system. And then you get to decide who gets the loans to develop those resources and to turn them into financialized flows through your banking system. And so obviously, the Western Empire would prefer that those be companies like BP and Shell and Halliburton and so forth, and that they fund this development through Western banks. If it's controlled by the Russians or by the Ukrainians or independently, Belarus by Iran and so forth, then it's no good to the Western financial system at all.
Andrew, can I just jump in there?
Yes, please, James.
Yeah, exactly. You absolutely nailed it there, Alex. I totally agree with you in terms of the geopolitics of this. And, in terms of breaking that down further, because you can ask, why is the West giving all these loans to Ukraine? Because Ukraine is never going to be able to pay them back. It's just not. So why is it giving loans? Well, the reason it's giving loans, and this was, I watched a video of RFK Jr., who explained this very, very clearly. It's a great video that's been put out. I think it was actually posted by Trump in the last few days. The reason they give loans is because they can put conditions on those loans. And one of the conditions they put on these loans to Ukraine is that it has to put a lot of its land up for sale. And 30% of Ukraine's land is now being bought by companies such as Monsanto and other Western corporations. So, there is a strategic geopolitical angle to this, of course, but essentially it comes down to greed, Western greed, and Western imperialism over the East and over Eurasia, like you said, Alex. But yeah, it's absolutely it's amazing what's going on when you consider how most people in the West view what's going on. They think that we're coming to the rescue of Ukraine. Everyone's waving their little Ukrainian flags when actually what's really happening is this is daylight robbery. We're going into Ukraine and we're stealing all of their assets while their young men get killed on the battlefield. Quite extraordinary, really.
Well, it's also, a scandalous suggestion. Well, let's unpack that as well, though, James, because you say that they're there and the land's up for sale. Do we have evidence that the land has actually been sold to third parties? What's been sold and to whom?
Oh God, I don't have all of the details here, but if you want to go and look at and do a bit of research, look for that video. It's on X. Like I said, Trump posted it. It's part of their campaign explaining what is going on in Ukraine. If you watch that video and look at other stuff that RFK has done, I'm not an expert in this area. I'm just repeating what he said. But listen, I've got no doubts what he's talking about, and I've heard other experts talking about this as well. It is. And another, the other thing to note here is this is a common tactic of the World Bank. They go into countries, they loan them billions and billions of dollars, and the reason they do that is because they can put all these conditions, like you've got to sell off all of your national assets, whether they're companies, the nationalized companies, you've got to sell them to private investors. If you've got oil, you need to give that up to BP and Shell and all of these other companies. So this is not a new sort of tactic that they're deploying in Ukraine. This is a long-held strategy of institutions like the World Bank.
Yeah, I'm very keen, as I say, we will revisit this. I think the idea, let's set out the facts, because if what the West is doing is actually worse than what Putin was suggesting, just trying to take it, and they're taking it by default, if you like, I think we do need to drill down and look at those specifics. Can you shed any light on that, Alex?
Yeah, of course. I entirely agree with James, and it goes back a very, very long time. But with respect to Ukraine, you can make the case that it was, in fact, the IMF who demanded the anti-terror operation in 2014 after the coup in Ukraine, because as soon as the coup happened, you had very quickly independence movement burgeoning in South and East Ukraine. South and East Ukraine is pretty much half of Ukraine's resource wealth and something like 80 to 90% of its GDP. So when the new government led by Yevgeny Yatsenyuk took over in February of 2014, then you had these independence movements and the resistant movements that risked Western control of East and South Ukraine. So right about April of 2014, the IMF demanded from the Yatsenyuk government to take control of all of Ukraine by force if necessary, or else their IMF loans were in jeopardy. And so there was Jack Lew at the time was a Treasury Secretary in the United States who pretty much informed Christine Lagarde, who was at the time head of the IMF, to demand of the Ukraine government to launch an anti-terror operation and to clean out the resistance movements in the Donbas, in the East Ukraine, and in the South Ukraine. And then this anti-terror operation was launched in April, and then in May we had that massacre in Odessa on the 2nd May, when they killed something like 115 people in Odessa, many of them burnt alive. And you could argue that the imperative strategy to wrest control of Ukraine and the Donbas by force came straight from the IMF. So it's the banking interests that have been at the forefront of deciding the tactics and the strategy of that geopolitical struggle.
Right.
And Andrew,
it is.
I've actually
James,
just
go for it.
while Alex was speaking there, I've actually pulled up this speech. If I just read a couple of paragraphs from it, because I think it does. This is from RFK. So the biggest single asset in Europe in Ukraine is their farmland. There's been 1,000 years wars fought over the land as the richest farmland in the world. It is the breadbasket of Europe. Almost 500,000 Ukrainian kids have died to keep that land part of Ukraine. Talking about historically there, they almost certainly didn't know about this loan conditions, what I was talking about. So they've already sold 30% of it. The buyers were DuPont, Cargill, and Monsanto. And who do you think owns all of these companies? He says, yes, BlackRock. And I think it was in December last year, President Biden gave the contract to rebuild Ukraine. They gave it to BlackRock, and BlackRock have already sold off 30% of the land in Ukraine. So, like I said, what is actually going on, contrary to this, we're coming in to save Ukraine from big, bad, evil Putin, it's a land grab. They're going in there. They've told their citizens they're doing one thing. So because I think Western citizens would not support what is going on if they knew the truth. And by the way, Andrew, we've talked a lot about free speech on this program and why the clampdown is happening at the moment. It is because of this. Because Western governments do not want their citizens learning about the truth about what is going on in Ukraine, because they will put a stop to it straight away. So that is why they're clamping down on free speech. It's nothing to do with paedophiles and all this kind of nonsense which they're talking about. It is to preserve and keep the truth concealed about what they're doing here, which is essentially daylight robbery.
Yeah, and that's the headline, isn't it? And as you say, nobody in the media, other than those on TNT and RFK Jr., is sort of highlighting this point, which is why free speech, we need to have it. People need to know what's really going on. It is a land grab. People say that Putin's the big bad wolf. Well, actually, the big bad wolf seem to be the people who are holding out these loans in order to grab that land. It's a shocking revelation. We're going to do a deeper dive into all of this straight after these messages.